going on, y'all? It's your boy Alex, and today in this PO433 vlog, we are going to be touching on stuff that's a little tricky, and that is the recommendations from the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission from the lens of childhood welfare and education policy in Canada, and why these calls to action made by the TRC will be incredibly difficult to implement. Okay, that was a mouthful, and without further ado, put on your policy lenses, and let's get into the fun part of this, learning. So what is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRC, was set up in Canada to address and reflect upon the suffering and injustices faced by Indigenous peoples in Canada, especially those impacted by the residential school system. This was done by the gathering of testimonies and creating a sound record of injustices committed, like you would with any other crime. Alright, so we're going to break this video down into 3 parts and look at the calls to action by the TRC 3, 4, and 10 surrounding child welfare and education, discussing the difficulties Canada would have in attempting to implement these calls to action. Alright, let's get into the fun part and start learning. So, to begin on a grim note, a large part of the history of public policy and Indigenous child welfare in Canada revolves around the institutions known as residential schools, which were institutions across Canada which Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and tribes to be forcefully assimilated into Eurocentric Canadian society. As was discussed in detail in the TRC panel video, these schools operated for nearly a century in Canada and were often the sites of abuses, sexual assault, and cultural erasure, with the long-lasting and far-reaching impacts of these residential schools having enormous impacts which manifest themselves today in a variety of ways, almost none of them being good, such as addiction and abusive behavior. This could be because of the interconnectedness between the modern child welfare system and the old residential school system, because of the overreaching goals of both child welfare programs is the separation of Indigenous people from their traditional communities and placing them in foreign environments, which will inevitably cause them to lose their Indigenous identity over time. The only difference is the modern child welfare program places Indigenous children with predominantly white families under the pretext that their home environment isn't sustainable because of the singular inspection, as opposed to it being because of their inherently savage way of life. I hope all of you are starting to notice some parallels here. This doesn't even begin to touch on the issue of there already being massive levels of disproportionality in terms of how many Indigenous children are currently in or going through the child welfare program in Canada. This call to action in the framework of the already existing and historical public policy initiatives enacted by Canada concerning child welfare raises a lot of red flags to those who recognize the colonialist implications of the system and leaves many questions that Canada has refused to answer remaining unanswered. What happens to the many Indigenous children going through or who have already gone through the child welfare program because of their living situation being deemed unsustainable in the inspection process before the TRC call to action? So many questions remain unanswered concerning this call to action, and the possibilities of the Canadian public policy regime concerning Indigenous children seem so limited. Alright, so it looks like this video is going to be a gloomy one because I have to explain another bummer to you. Canadian expansion and reservations. Canadian expansion and settlement that subsequently led to the creation of the reservations for Indigenous nations was a process by which Europeans would acquire lands where supposedly savage Indians lived by means like warfare and treaties, and would inevitably open that land up to white settlement. The widespread continuation of this process eventually caused the creation of Canada in its modern form, and left Indigenous communities in social and cultural isolation in sparsely populated areas of the country and the remote fringes of large urban centers. Naturally, the cause and effect of this was predictable, as this left Indigenous communities completely neglected and underfunded by the Canadian government. However, the TRC believes they've found a solution as they call on the government to mandate the Jordan Principle, which attempts to give Indigenous people access to social services they need but the scope of the TRC's uses for the implementation of this can be quite ineffective, especially with Canada's public policy history and structure concerning Indigenous child welfare. Instead of opening the conversation concerning dispossession of land and social isolation with discussions for housing and ideas on how to revitalize Indigenous reservations and have them be more connected to social services directly within their own communities and their surrounding communities, the TRC simply advocates that the government set up a framework to have these Indigenous children connected to some sort of social services, regardless of what type. But for example, can we really say if you live in rural northern Ontario, an online consultation with a doctor is the same as being able to visit a doctor in real life? I wouldn't say so. Thus, the TRC call to action fails to address the very fundamental public policy issue of dispossession and isolation caused by the reservation system in Canada when addressing the urgent need for social services to be connected to Indigenous communities. On top of this, the TRC rather ignorantly believes that somehow the way the Canadian government exercises its authority via these treaties is supposedly the normal and hegemonic way to do so, when we know that Indigenous communities saw treaties in a vastly different way to Europeans, with many believing treaties as something that should be perpetually renewed and worked on to maintain the best stewardship over the land for both parties, which the TRC completely fails to recognize. One of the most important aspects of raising a child to be a happy, healthy adult is giving them a proper education and ensuring they have prospects for advancement in their education, which Canadian public policy has lacked for Indigenous children for decades and which the TRC fails to address. The TRC Call to Action number 10 attempts to amend this issue by calling on the federal government to draw new educational legislation with the participation of Indigenous people in an attempt to close educational opportunity gaps. But what the TRC doesn't acknowledge is that this has been attempted numerous times in numerous ways by the Canadian state when dealing with the most consequential Canadian public policy initiative, the Indian Act. In 1969, with pressure mounting to amend and create a modernized Indian Act, Canada began discussions about amending the local government and educational structures of band councils, which would have paved the way for education being run by band councils and having Indigenous education being centered on Indigenous cultural reinvigoration. However, the rather archaic nature of the legal structure addressed in the Indian Act, combined with pushback from the Indigenous leaders due to the disagreements with land rights, caused the attempted amendment to fade away. It was the public policy initiative concerning Indigenous people created in 1876 that quite literally has tied the hands of the Canadian state and has continuously caused the failure to bring reform to Indigenous child welfare. The TRC makes no mention of the legal framework issues caused by the Indian Act when it comes to the child welfare and education. However, the TRC also doesn't recognize a major issue caused by the lack of comprehensive education for Indigenous youth, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. This phenomenon stands as a sharp reminder of what Canadian public policy regarding the education of Indigenous youth has done because of the Indian Act closed off so many avenues for women's education via sources like employment. The Indian Act for centuries barred women from participating in any way in tribal politics, essentially allowing for the wholesale neglecting of women's educational and employment needs on reserves dominated by male leaders. I hope I do not have to explain too much, but leaving women out of the decision-making process for decades essentially cut women out of the educational and employment needs pool, as reserves became dominated by male interests and male voices. Alright folks, that's a wrap. Thank you for watching today's deep dive into the tricky waters of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, with specifically focusing in the realm of child welfare and education policy. We've unpacked some complex issues, explored the challenges ahead, and hopefully shed some light on why implementing these calls to action is going to be no walk in the park for Canada. So, as we wrap up, I just want to encourage you to keep those policy lenses on and have a great day.